I already used the Fujifilm X-T4 for about 1 year, so in this video I want to share my thoughts with you. We'll do a little review here based on my experiences, and we'll also find out if you should still buy the Fujifilm X-T4 in 2021 or not. And this review will mostly be about the video specs, because I'm a videographer, not a photographer, but it's a great hybrid camera. It's already pretty hot. Even if the sun is only up for like half an hour, it gets really hot here in Thailand right now, pretty quick in the morning. So let's talk about the Fujifilm X-T4, and I would say you likely already know all the specs from this camera when you watch this review, like 4K 60 FPS and 10-bit with inbuilt stabilization and actually pretty good dynamic range and low light, etc. So I will not go through all those specs here. You can look at that on the paper, but I want to mainly address the issues that, or the worries that people have about this camera. The first one is, I would say, the autofocus. Autofocus is a very important point for many people, including myself, because I shoot a lot of YouTube videos, etc. I have to get shots of myself, and that's where I definitely want to have good autofocus. I mean, I used the Panasonic GH5 for about 3 years, and I was always able to somehow manage it via the app and lock the focus on my face, etc. But on the Fujifilm X-T4, I actually don't have to do that. The autofocus is not as good as Sony or Canon. Like right now, I'm shooting on a Sony a7S III here, and it makes it a little bit easier because I really can just put it to wide. I get in front of the camera and tracks my face. It's not the case on Fuji. On Fuji you have to put a bit more work in to make the autofocus work for you, but it's actually not that much. How you usually do it is that you simply make sure that the focus point is on your face, and then you also turn face tracking on to be absolutely safe, because the main issue with the autofocus of this camera when you get shots of yourself is that when the autofocus point is not on your face but it's somewhere else and you have face tracking on, then as long as you look in the camera, it actually does a pretty good job as long as you use good lenses with it. So when you use Fuji lenses, you get the lenses that contain the letters LM. It stands for linear motors, and these motors work a bit faster, so they are better for video. But also third-party lenses like the Sigma 18-35 with the Fringer adapter does a good job when it comes to autofocus, and also all the Viltrox lenses. I tested 3 of them and they all perform really well. So the problem is here really that when you watch somewhere else, like I would do right now, but right now it wouldn't happen anything because I'm shooting on a Sony a7S III, but then it would stop face tracking and it would automatically focus where the focus point is. And that's why it's so important on the Fujifilm X-T4 to set the focus point on your face, then you don't get these issues with the autofocus. And aside from that, the autofocus is actually pretty reliable. Like when I shot other people and they came closer to the camera, I simply kept the autofocus point where the person was walking, and it has never been an issue. It always worked pretty good. So I don't have any big issues with the autofocus here. It's just a little inconvenience that you always have to set the focus point where you are, but aside from that, it really works well. And I think that if you're someone that wants to get shots of yourself but also lots of B-roll shots, then this camera will do perfectly fine. It takes a few seconds longer to set the focus point, but aside from that, this camera is so amazing for B-roll, which we'll come to in a second, that it's absolutely worth it to put this few seconds more in the shots where you record yourself. And if you're behind the camera and you get shots of other people, it's usually not an issue as well. You can always either use manual focus or you also put the focus point on the face, so you're behind the camera anyway, so it doesn't make any difference there. Let's talk about B-roll on this camera, and I would say that for B-roll this camera is really perfect. You have 4K 60 FPS, 10-bit, amazing Fuji colors and inbuilt stabilization, and all of that is very important for B-roll because you obviously want to have smooth B-roll footage. You don't want to have unnecessary camera shake in there when you shoot handheld. Then you oftentimes want to have slow motion to emphasize certain shots, and of course you also want to have great colors when you shoot B-roll. And I mean, straight out of camera the colors are already amazing because of all these film simulations from Fuji, but even if you want to create your own color palette, you can shoot an F-Log, you have 10-bit, and that means that you can color grade the hell out of this footage. Like when I color grade the footage from this camera, I never had any issues, and maybe if you go way too far you would get some, but you wouldn't do that, so that's perfectly fine here. And I shot in HEVC and 200 mbits all the time, so if you want to do the same 10-bit, 200 mbits, doesn't matter if 24 FPS or 60, you need a computer that can handle that. So usually a MacBook after 2017 does a good job, but I would actually recommend the new M1 MacBooks. They cut this footage like butter. And let me know in the comments below how you like Fujifilm colors. Do you like this more filmic desaturated look, or are you more into more vibrant colors like Canon does that? What also plays an important role for both B-roll and A-roll is the dynamic range, of course, from this camera, and also the low light sometimes. And I must say that I'm very happy with the dynamic range. It's, of course, it's not on the same level as on the on the Sony a7S III, for example. But considering that's an APS-C camera, you actually get plenty of dynamic range. I did not measure it in stops, like I'm not a scientist, but from what I could see, I always either got enough detail in the highlights, as long as I was not directly shooting into the sun, and I could still see enough in the shadows. Of course, if you want to have a shot where you are inside and the person should be well exposed, and you also want to see the trees outside or whatever, that would likely not work with this camera. But it's also not a big issue because the roll-off into the highlights on this camera is really nice and smooth. I think for all the mirrorless cameras, not cinema cameras, below $2,500, let's say, this is one of the best roll-offs that I've ever seen. Also, the fall-off into the shadow is also pretty smooth. So even if you have to over or underexpose a little bit, it's actually not that much of an issue because it still looks nice. And to me, that's even more important than dynamic range. If I have a nice smooth roll off and fall off, then the footage always looks amazing, and as long as you expose well for your subject, you don't get any issues there. But overall, the dynamic range is really impressive, and also low light. Before I switched to the Fujifilm X-T4, I used the Canon EOS R, and I can definitely say that the low light performance of the Fujifilm is better than the EOS R, even if that's a full frame camera. So it's not just about sensor size here, it's also about what they do with the sensor. Like, that's a backside illuminated sensor, what definitely helps, but it's also about how they read the sensor, etc. And with this X-Trans sensor, you just get a sensor that works a bit different than other sensors, and I think that does a pretty good job. So low light performance, actually I was able to shoot an f-log at ISO 10,000 in a night, and I got usable results. Of course, when you import the footage on your computer, you can see a lot of noise, but then after color grading it, because you slightly overexpose f-log, the noise disappears because you bring the exposure closer to the noise throw. Of course, you can still see a little bit of noise then at ISO 10,000, that's expected, but it's not that it's not usable anymore. It's still on a very good level. And another worry about this camera that a lot of people seem to have in my comment section of other X-T4 videos is the overheating. And to be honest, to me, the camera never overheated. It gets hot sometimes, of course, but a camera getting hot is pretty normal. Like, even my Sony a7S III, when I record for an hour, it feels pretty hot after that. But that's totally fine. It doesn't mean that your camera gets damaged or something like that. The camera will shut down before it gets too hot. But as mentioned before, I never had this case where the camera actually shut down, and it's probably because when I shoot 4K 60 FPS, it's more like on and off shooting for maybe half an hour or something like that. So the camera can cool down in between the shots all the time. And when I film for longer periods, when I talk on the camera, for example, and I always have it to 4K 24. And even here when I shot outside, I never had any issues. But if in case you get any issues for whatever reason, maybe it's way too hot or you record for 3-4 hours or something like that, then a tip that I can give you here to prevent overheating is to use an Atomos Ninja V, like an external recorder. You can put that on your camera, you connect it via HDMI, and then you can record directly in ProRes on an SSD drive, which is really nice because it gives you a easy workflow, and because it records on the SSD externally and not on the SD card internally, what you can also do if you want to, but you mustn't, then you prevent overheating. This is actually a little trick that people use with many cameras. Recording externally always causes less heat inside of the camera, and therefore you can go around such limits. You also don't have a 30 minutes record limit when you use external recorders like that. So if you're more into professional video production, I can definitely recommend getting an Atomos Ninja V. And another point where the Fuji gets a bit of criticism is the IBIS Performance, because sometimes when you move the camera a little bit. It can sometimes be that it gets a bit of those IBIS jitters, but it's actually not much of a problem. They greatly improved it with the firmware, I think it was the firmware 1.2 or something like that. I made a video about that and was much better than before, but it still had this issue sometimes a bit. So if you get these issues, what I can recommend at first, if you want to fix it in camera, move the camera a little bit slower or faster depending on the shot really. Like sometimes it's like that at one speed you get this issue and another one not. You can also start by having a bit more motion at the beginning of the shot, and then that can also help a little bit. But also, if you can't avoid it, or if you got a shot that you really want to use and it has these issues, just add stabilization in your video editing app. I use Final Cut for that, and this stabilization compensates for this lagginess then, and it actually doesn't crop that much, so you don't lose much quality there, and instantly looks pretty smooth. So that's what I did a lot of times when I got this issue with this camera. So overall, it's not a big issue in my opinion, but it's something to be aware about. So I think these are the most important points when it comes to this camera. So now let's find out if this camera is for you and what cameras does it compare to, and should you still get it in 2021. But before we do that, let me also tell you that I think if you're looking into this camera, it's likely not the very first camera you get. It's likely the second or third camera that you get when you want to get a bit more into videography and you want to become more advanced. And if that's the case for you, you should have a look at my new videography online courses. I recently published a bundle called Learn with Pascal. There you can either get single courses or you can buy it as a whole package and get a huge discount there. And this includes courses about camera basics, about practical videography, about video editing, color grading, and also video business, so how to actually make money with video work. So if that sounds interesting for you, you will find a link to that in the description below. But let's now talk about what this camera compares to. So this camera is at about $1,700. So there are actually quite a lot of cameras that are in the market for you, likely if you look into this camera. And I would say it really depends at first on your budget, of course, but also about the shots that you mostly get. Because the only really point where this camera is a bit weaker than many competitors is the autofocus here really. So if you mostly shoot videos of yourself where you just sit in front of the camera like I do right now and you talk, you don't shoot much B-roll, etc., then I would probably go for an A7C or an A6600 if you need inbuilt stabilization, or even A6400 if you don't need that. But if you also shoot a lot of B-roll and color grading, etc., is pretty important for you, and you're looking for a camera that's somewhere below $2,000, then I can definitely recommend this camera. Actually, on the gray market here in Thailand, I got this camera for 1,400 euros around. So I think for what you get with this camera, that's a steal. So I think really below $2,000 there's no better camera that does it all, like shooting great B-roll, shooting great A-roll, and also do a bit of photography work. Actually not a bit, it's actually a pretty good photography camera. So I think below $2,000 that's definitely the one to go. If above $2,000 it's also okay for you, the cameras that you would likely also look into is the Panasonic S5 and the R6. Now the R6, I would say that if you only do a little bit of photography but also mostly video work and you don't record too long, then the R6 could actually be a pretty good option. But also lenses are a bit more on the expensive side on this camera. Actually on the Fujifilm you can get lenses for pretty cheap prices already. In the Canon RF system that's not really the case if you don't want to adapt EF lenses, but also the Canon R6 has much worse overheating than the Fujifilm X-T4, so you could end up not being able to record all of your interview sessions, etc. So keep that in mind. Panasonic S5, as far as I know, has worse autofocus. I did not try the camera by myself, so I can only talk about what I heard from other reviewers there. But the S5, of course, it's full frame, so you have even better low light, even better dynamic range, etc. And also V-Log is pretty nice from the Panasonic, but the autofocus, as mentioned before, is pretty bad on that camera. So I would likely rather go for a Fuji instead of the S5, but it looks like a great camera as well. So if you want to have more this full frame, wide angle, shallow depth of field look, then that's probably the camera to get. Otherwise, if your budget is really not limited, then Canon R5 or Sony a7S III. The R5 has the same issues as the R6 basically, with all the overheating going on. That's why, as long as you don't do mainly photography and the occasional video work, I would not go for the Canon R5, but well, if you're mostly a photographer and you want to shoot some videos, then the R5 is probably a camera that you should look into. Otherwise, if you mostly do video work and you also do some photography for social media, the Sony a7S III is actually perfectly fine. I shot a lot of photos, like all my thumbnails recently on this camera, and I never had any issues there with the megapixels, so totally fine. That, like, if you don't know, like, the weak point of the a7S III is basically the 12 megapixels for photography, but for videography that's actually a good one because you get better low light and more dynamic range, less noise, etc. So it's actually great for videographers. So yeah, that's my conclusion here. Really, if you want a great hybrid camera that does especially great video work, great colors, etc., then the Fujifilm X-T4 is definitely a camera to look into, even in 2021. And I must actually say that if you get this camera, it will likely be the camera that you can still use for the next 3 or maybe even 5 years. It will not get old that quick. The world still has not adapted to 4K even. It has 4K 60 FPS, so that will last you a pretty long time. So I would say, before we end this video, please let me know in the comments below if you have any wishes for specific videos about the Fujifilm X-T4. I already produced a bunch of, like, about autofocus, etc. So check them out as well, but it would be great to hear what you want to know more about, because I would probably own this camera more for like half a year or so until the Sony a7 IV comes out. Then I think I will switch to Sony, depending on the specs, of course, because I want to be able to use the same lenses all the time and not carry extra lenses for Fuji with me. Otherwise I would stick to Fuji. But until there, I will definitely produce more videos about the Fujifilm X-T4 because I think it's an amazing camera. So just let me know in the comments below what videos you want to have there. Aside from that, I hope you enjoyed this video and it was helpful. If yes, then leave me a thumbs up, and also don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell notifications button for upcoming videos about the Fujifilm X-T4, but also about general videography. See ya!